Okay, so let's talk a little bit about functional anatomy. When I say functional anatomy, I want to specifically, kind of highlight, look, this is the deal. We are talking about not like, I'm not going to label the organs, but I'm going to kind of highlight the path, okay? So, structurally, female reproductive system, and I feel weird explaining it to the entirely female audience. So vagina. Now what you need to understand, by the way, speaking of which, the epithelium on the glans penis and on the surface of vagina, it's stratified squamous because of the rubbing involved during the intercourse. Okay, so vagina, then you have uterus, and uterus, three parts. So the parts that is proximal to vagina is the cervix. The biggest, like the widest part of the uterus is the body, and the superior part, that's where fallopian tubes merge into it, is fundus. And then fallopian tubes. Now, what I want you to appreciate, we've got one more organ left, listen, and it's ovaries, right? And the ovaries are located at the end of the ampulla of fallopian tubes. Now, look, it's important to understand, ovaries and fallopian tubes are not physically connected. Does that make sense? So, look, I'm not going to draw any, well, I'm not going to draw anything. When ovaries release the secondary oocyte, where does it go? Where it's supposed to go? Into the fallopian tubes, right? But first, it goes into the pelvic cavity. Does that make sense? And what sometimes can happen, and we're going to get to this, what sometimes can happen, it may get lost in the pelvic cavity, the oocyte. Does that make sense? Is it bad? It's not, just lost. I mean, it can be fertilized, right? You see what I'm saying? It's not going to damage anything. Like, it's going to eventually just die and be destroyed, disintegrate, but that happens sometimes. So, fallopian tubes, they have little villi that kind of make this movement to get the oocyte into the fallopian tubes, right? And then I'm going to quickly go over, like, without even writing anything, the process of, like, fertilization. So, secondary oocyte moves through the fallopian tubes. Are you with me? Sperm cells, spermatozoa, move from vagina into uterus, into the fallopian tubes. Does that make sense? To give you a proportion, as far as I remember, ejaculation, say 5 million sperm cells, okay? Only about 1,000 reach fallopian tubes. Does that make sense to you? And then out of this 1,000, only one will fertilize secondary oocyte. So fertilization, and I want you to understand it clearly, fertilization in the normal physiological conditions, it happens in the fallopian tubes. Does that make sense? Are we clear? And then fertilized egg, look here, it keeps moving through the fallopian tube into the uterus. Got it? Does that make sense? Now, quick sort of clinically important note. What happens if there was some kind of an infection, sexually transmitted disease, that affected fallopian tubes and resulted in the formation of a scar tissue? Scar tissue does not have cilia. Are you following me? Which means the oocyte cannot properly move with the same speed. Are you following me again? But it's still fertilized oocyte keeps developing. And the blastocyst, instead of implanting into uterus, stays in a fallopian tube and starts developing. What do we call it? Ectopic pregnancy, right? And this is dangerous because it's not in the proper spot that is not ideally designed for it. On top of worse, if the oocyte is fertilized outside of the fallopian tube, that can happen, and starts developing not in the tube, but at the ampulla, for example, at the entrance. Does that make sense? This is like this is the ectopic pregnancy basically in the pelvic cavity. That's terrible. That part, does that make sense? Now, so a few words about the uterine anatomy. Okay, check this out. 3 layers, perimetrium, which is the outermost, and it's basically a connective tissue, the structural layer. Meiometrium. Uterus has an extremely thick layer of smooth muscle. We good? Endometrium. Now, endometrium is the innermost layer of the uterus. And what I want you to understand very, very clearly, look at this. It has 2 strata, stratum functionalis and stratum basalis. Okay? That makes sense? Now, why I pay so much attention to this? Because this will become extremely important when we're going to talk about menses. Okay, so what I want you to understand, so stratum basalis doesn't die. Okay, the function of stratum basalis, check this out, is to generate new stratum functionalis every roughly 28 days. Are you following me? Does that make, and we're gonna figure out how it happens. Okay? So for now, what I want to jump onto immediately is the generation of the ovarian cycle. Okay, before we get there, we need to highlight a few structures. So inside the ovaries, you're going to find follicles. Okay? In the follicles, you're going to find oocytes. Okay? Does that make sense? So as oocytes develop, the follicular structure develops as well. Are you with me? So we go from primordial follicle to primary follicle to secondary follicle to mature follicle. I want to focus on the development of oocytes. And the idea is that the cells that oocytes develop from called oogonia. Okay, that makes sense? So they are diploid. Are you with me? So oogonia, they develop into the first polar body, which is not anything, and the primary oocyte. So this is meiosis 1. Okay, so the question is, when does it happen? The development of primary oocytes, listen, happens during embryonic development. Okay, that makes sense? Now then, female grows, okay, and then when ovarian cycle starts, different age. This is what happens roughly once a month. Look, meiosis 1 is incomplete. Is that understood? So every cell, it's not quite there yet, okay? It's almost there. So primary oocyte, meiosis 1 being completed, and then primary oocyte. Okay, so primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 and develops into the secondary oocyte. And here I want to highlight this. So every ovarian cycle, listen, you have an incomplete meiosis 2, which results in a secondary oocyte. This secondary oocyte is a center of the mature follicle. Does that make sense? When mature follicle ovulates, when it ruptures, look what happens. Secondary oocyte enters the fallopian tube. Are you with me? What I want you to understand, the cell that goes into the fallopian tube isn't an egg yet. It is called a secondary oocyte. It has to complete meiosis 2 to become an egg. So technically, like, it's, I'm going to put incomplete. It has to complete meiosis 2 to become an egg. And what serves as the stimulus for the completion? Fertilization. Does that make sense? No?
So it gets fertilized first and then becomes an egg?
So when, like it, you can think of it's probably kind of it's not purely a terminological issue, but the cell that goes into the fallopian tube isn't a mature, the meiosis 2 is not complete yet. When secondary oocyte encounters a sperm cell and they fuse, that immediately triggers the completion of meiosis 2 and it becomes an egg. So technically speaking, you can't collect unfertilized eggs. You can collect secondary oocytes. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what I want to highlight, first of all, how often does a male produce sperm cells? All the time, right? Like, this process never stops. As long as testosterone is produced, as long as ABP is produced, male will produce sperm cells, right? Now, how often does a female produce a secondary oocyte? Once a month, roughly. Does that make sense? So, is the number limited? I'm asking you. Is the number of secondary oocytes that can be produced throughout the lifetime, is it limited? Jury is out there. It looks like it is limited. Now, the question is, can an adult female, no, let me rephrase it. In an adult, physiologically healthy woman, does this process still happen? And the answer is possibly. If it does, it doesn't contribute much to the number of oocytes that a woman can produce. Does that make sense? Which immediately limits the number of children that a woman can bear. You see what I'm saying?
So do you have a predetermined amount of oocytes?
Basically, yes. There's a certain number, like males, I don't think there's any limit on the number of sperm cells. Well, except the life expectancy, right? Like dead people don't generate sperm, but in terms of like number of sperm cells, there's no limit. You see what I'm saying? Female, there is. Okay? Which still, we can think of it like from the pregnancy perspective. Now, another thing that I want to highlight. Primary and secondary oocytes are all haploid, okay? So, if you think about it, in males, look, in males, every spermatogonium, every originally diploid cell, develops into 4 sperm cells. Remember that? In females, 1 oogonium develops into 1 oocyte. Now, from evolutionary, I want you to look at it from more philosophically evolutionary perspective, so to say. Historically, evolutionary, if you look at humans as biological species, not societal species, but species that lived like 100,000 years ago, who was responsible for raising a child? Women. Men were sort of replaceable, you know? Does that make sense? So the function of a male was to fertilize. It was the function of a woman to bear a child, to give it birth, and to take care of a child. Now, if a woman generates 4 oocytes during each ovarian cycle, would, hypothetically, that would put a lot of burden on a woman. Does that make sense? Because the number of sperm cells, there is enough to fertilize 1,000 oocytes, for that matter. See what I'm saying? So 4, 1, not a problem. Does that make sense? And limiting it by 1 per ovarian cycle kind of limits the resources that woman would spend on maintaining that oocyte and eventually on maintaining the development of a fertilized egg and blastocyst and, embryo. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? I'm kind of expecting.
So if you have twins,
I do.
Do you have 2 oocytes?
Great question. In our case, I have fraternal twins. Yes.
2 separate oocytes?
It is known that sometimes stress can result in the simultaneous ovulation of 2 mature follicles instead of 1. So release of 2 oocytes. Does that make sense? Obviously, the probability of that event, the more follicles released together, the less likely it is to happen. So I actually do know a couple with triplets, fraternal triplets. Well, actually no, 2 couples. Well, I know 2 families, let's put it this way. One of them is not a couple. With fraternal triplets. This is incredibly rare. And those were not extracorporeal fertilization, But there's another opportunity. A fertilized egg can split. Does that make sense? Split not just in 2 cells, but can separate into 2 independent fertilized eggs. This is identical twins. Does that make sense? So, fraternal, 2 independent oocytes, and in terms of genetic relationships, they are just like any brother and brother sister, brother sister, because they oocytes are genetically distinct, and the sperm cells are genetically distinct. There's some variability. In case of identical twins, since it's originally single cell that divides in 2, It's different. They are identical in essence. That makes sense? Good? Okay. So we got this.